Hello, welcome to another episode of the Rippling Pages podcast. Great writers making waves with the word, all in conversation with me, Liam Bishop. Today I'm joined by Joe Scott-Coe, and just before we go into the introduction and the episode, I'd just like to let you know that there are issues discussed of a sensitive nature in today's episode. Thank you. Today I'm joined by Joe Scott-Coe, a writer from California. After penning Teacher at Point Blank, published by Ant Lute Books, a book described as mediation on subtle and overt forms of violence in secondary public education from up close and a pink-collar point of view, Jo turned her attention to Charles Whitman, a man known as the Texas Tower Sniper. This is the subject of Mass, a Sniper, a Father, and a Priest, published by Telekinesis Press. Scott-Coe uncovers some of the more untold aspects of the man who killed his wife and mother, and the 15 other people on the University of Texas campus in 1966. Jo's nonfiction has appeared widely across the web and in print. She is also an associate professor of English at Riverside Community College in Southern California. She joins me today. So on the night of August the 1st in 1966, Charles Whitman killed his wife and mother. In the morning, he made his way to the University of Texas and opened fire, killing 15 people, the final victim dying in 2001 from their injuries. Can we just talk, Joe, about why you returned to this event that happened originally in 1966 and what significance you think it holds in the history of violent acts in America and inspired you to write this book?
You know, it's interesting because when I started working on Mass in 2012 or so, I didn't think that I was going to be writing an entire book about this story at all. I thought it was going to be the first of many chapters in a linked collection of essays that was going to kind of meditate on angles that had not been explored in stories of public violence. So it seemed in the US, it seemed like, well, this isn't the first massacre, certainly, but it is the first televised campus shooting. You know, there was real-time footage, coverage on the radio, coverage on television. And so it seemed to capture that sense of spectacle. For that reason, it was going to be the first chapter. And then what happened, of course, is that the more I studied and the more questions that I asked in looking at this question of religion and ritual to some degree, you know, mass media is a ritualized kind of a medium, and thinking about the way that the telling of the UT Austin story had been kind of locked down. It had been told in a certain way. You have the heroes, you have the villain, you have the obvious evildoer, the innocent victims in public, and so forth. And so it just seemed to me that in the US, we just had our 300th mass shooting event in June of 2021. So that's, less than halfway through the year, and we were at 300. So that idea of the ritual and the replication, the almost certainly logarithmic replication of these events, it just seemed to be kind of almost a flashpoint moment. It was saying more than maybe we thought it was saying, and so that's why I wanted to delve in more to it. And it was certainly before people expected, if they heard a bang in public, that it meant that we were having a mass shooting event.
Where did you first come across it then?
I think it's interesting. It's one of those iconographic shootings that you see pictures of the tower with the plume of gun smoke. Those things are circulated every year. Again, in mass media. I had heard about it. I had read a little bit about it because I was interested in school shootings. So it was kind of just a little, like a little topic headline, right? And it was something that I wanted to just understand more about. And so it wasn't that it was at a particular moment. I'd been writing about school shootings and school violence for some time, for almost 15 years at the point I started this book. And so Yeah, it was kind of more like I need to know more about this. That led me to looking at the secondary accounts of the shooting and the secondary synthesis that existed at the time that I was writing. And then it also took me back to the archives, of course, because I wanted to look at the primary materials.
For me, it was a new, it was new for me. It was a discovery of Charles Whitman and what happened. I wonder if there was any kind of different kind of responses to that.
I don't know, and I'm actually very interested in a British perspective on this book, and frankly, a perspective on this book from any country other than the United States. In part because we have this discrepant reality of gun violence, right? So there's the gun violence part, and then there's the mass violence part, which is another layer. But the one thing that we kind of share in common is a type of hegemonic or dominant masculinity, which always pulls for the gun or the knife or the fist, in order to dominate, in order to prove a certain kind of Western manhood. And so, what's fascinating is that much of the research that I have discovered over all of my work related to this question about gender, this question about performances or shows of force, comes out of away from the United States. Don't get me wrong, there's amazing gender scholarship inside the US, but really looking at and interrogating this question of how bad is bad enough before we get there, before we go to the public square, before we get the semi-automatic and the automatic weapons and take them into, a public space.
For this book, you do a lot of reporting, but you also build a narrative and you use some different narrative techniques as well as just obviously quite in-depth investigation. And there's a whole host, there's about 60, 70 pages, isn't there, of notes and supporting materials.
Yes.
And it's such a, it's a read. It's kind of also reads like these, well, it is a true crime story to an extent, but it reads like quite a sort of a thrilling true crime story, which isn't to take away from the seriousness of the event. I just wondered, setting out to write it like that, one of the terms that recurs a lot and is sort of, they're given the term senseless.
Yeah.
And this is terminology that you do explicitly grapple with at one point, but it also seems to be something that you're trying to work out throughout the book. What's at stake when we call Charles Whitman's act or any other acts of masculine senseless?
This is something that really haunts me. It haunts the book. I just wait for it every time we have a new report. It's live coverage, and wait for the senseless. You can almost set your watch to it. Within 30 seconds. And as a language person, as a writer, that idea of senselessness implies that if only it were the sensible kind. If only it were, if you think, for example, in the case of Whitman, if Whitman had just been pointing his gun at someone in Vietnam on the right side of the demilitarized zone, if only we had sent him and he'd been killing it the way we told him to do it, or if only he had killed someone and we didn't have to hear about it, if he had stopped, for example, with the murder of his wife and his mother, if he'd quote unquote only killed them, we could make up a story about how, well, there was probably a reason and he had his reasons and so forth. So it's very interesting that we have this idea, I talk about this in the book also, of the good kill, which is actually inside the Judeo-Christian tradition. Violence is sacralized, it's made sacred, it's a gateway. I think the book is in some way asking us to consider why the violence is an affront to our humanity, but why it also makes sense inside that milieu, inside that world. And it also explains why we fixate on certain kinds of violence. It doesn't really require a great deal of moral sophistication to say that someone going to the top of a tower in a public place and shooting at strangers, the first of whom is a heavily pregnant woman, that is an atrocity. It really doesn't require a whole lot of nuance and understanding to be outraged about that. We throw down the senseless gauntlet, and we avoid that examination of conscience that's necessary to understand, well, this was the end of that story that day. It was not, and there was something else was in motion before, and what was it, and who were the actors, and who were the people, and as opposed to seeing it as this isolated, strange thing. I think that we need to maybe look at violence as something that we can examine and understand, and not by distancing ourselves from it, but by recognize in some ways our subtle and sometimes not so subtle complicities with it.
The last person to die from their injuries was in 2001. So
right.
They've lived with the physical ramifications and also the kind of psychological ramifications. And you do an interesting thing with the book, because you do sort of isolate the event. You take this event and you focus on the main actors, as you call it, who are Whitman and the priest. But because what it sort of seems to do is that it heightens all these ideals that are around at the time. At the same time, you have these very imagine Charles Whitman, he was in the Marines, wasn't he? So I imagine he was a very kind of patriotic man, and Priest Leduc is obviously was Catholic. So it takes these very sort of strict ideals and it puts them at odds with the violent act, the killing and the murder. This idea then of a good kill, can you just talk a bit more about how that then relates to? Is it a Christian idea? Is it a sort of American idea? Are we talking about sort of sacrifice?
One of the moments that I describe towards the end of that middle section is one of the last visits at the time I had made to Houston, Texas for a site visit for a place where the priest and Charles Whitman had hung out, and I had met with a friend of Whitman, and in any case, as I was leaving, it was the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend, which is a 3-day weekend in January. And at the time, this film, which I don't know if is crossed the Atlantic, I'm sure that it has, the Sniper had just broken all these box office records, and and I don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but it's just about this idealized killer, the killer that we send overseas to make these good kills, right? And he keeps
the Bradley Cooper film,
American Sniper, or just the Sniper?
I think it's American Sniper, isn't it? Which I think is probably quite important.
Exactly. And there we are. And I mean, wait, is this a story about Charles Whitman? No. This is the good one, right? So for me, it was just this hideous mashup. Never mind on the weekend when a civil rights leader, was assassinated coming out of his hotel room. That, and then they're also, thinking about inside the religious ritual, in the Catholic ritual, it's a very precise thing that's happening on the altar. There is this idea that the priest is reenacting the sacrifice of Christ on the cross in a non-bloody way, the caveat, right? And that everyone is participating in the redemptive power of this ritual when they partake of the Eucharist and so forth. So there's this idea of, we're going to repeat the sacrifice of Christ, so the crucifixion. A lot of the images are fascinating from this period, that would have been in the catechism, and even catechism comics of the time that Whitman would have seen. Images that show Christ literally bleeding into the chalice, as the priest is offering it. Of course, the altar boy there with him. And so this idea about, well, that's a good kind of violence, that's a good kind of violence. It was commanded by God. It's transformative. It saves us all from our sins and so forth. So just these recurring motifs.
You've touched on bits about how you wrote the book and some of the investigations you did, and it centered around obviously Houston in Texas. A lot of the work in the book, like the actual investigation, seemed to be this uncovering of the priest Leduc, and it seemed like it did require a lot of work to uncover. I imagine, what were the challenges, I guess, to getting I guess the whole book's about the challenge, but I mean, in terms of,
Yeah.
I guess Whitman's story was a lot more easily accessible.
I mean, there are a lot of ways to look at this. I would say at first, so I'll go back to the beginning. At first, I thought, remember, I was going to write a chapter that was going to look at Charles Whitman as a Catholic, as a Catholic in the South. Huh, interesting. Okay. And so I was already thinking about that idea of ritual. And then when I found this statement by a priest, I'm like, oh, is he alive? Is he dead? I thought, okay, I'll check these boxes. A priest is in Catholic tradition someone that any person can lay claim to, right? He is my father by religious tradition. So, he's kind of a public figure. This really shouldn't be that mysterious. I thought maybe other people had written about him. They had not. And so what happened as this unfolded, every time I turned around, there was a new question and there was a new unsavory discovery or concerning discovery. So the things that made Leduc's story complicated to excavate were the degrees of geographical movement in his story. He was born in Waterbury, Connecticut, which is in the northeast of the United States, and then went to college in Massachusetts, and then to high school in Massachusetts at a boarding school, and then went to college in Ottawa and then went to seminary, and then went to another seminary. And meanwhile, he meets Charles Whitman at about when Charles Whitman is about the age of 9 in Florida. Now, there are reasons. There's just, I excavate the story. His parents moved and so forth, but a lot of moving before he becomes a priest, and then a lot of movement after he becomes a priest. Name change that appears in the official record that does not bode well. Has 13 different parish assignments after he's ordained in 1955, between 1955 and 1972, including out-of-state assignments. These are all things that then, of course, I had to understand. I had to go look at all of the research on problem priests or predator priests, because there was no complaint against this person who was dead. So how do we read this record if it's not transparent, if it's not shown, if you can't do a Freedom of Information Act request, which is a journalist tool in the US, if you can't do a FOIA request for a Catholic diocese, if you can't say, I need to see XYZ, then your options are very limited. But so you do other things. You're like, well, okay, I have to go to the seminary. So there was a great degree of travel. I had to interview people. I had to circle out and try to find folks that would talk to me before I went into the hierarchy. I interviewed former Archbishop Joseph Fiorenza of Galveston, Houston. And that was a very strange thing. It took like 6 weeks, and it took me a long time to even understand what the heck happened there. I thought I would be told, no, go away. But it was weirder than that. And so...
Yeah, I don't know if you just talk a bit more about that encounter, because it was you do write about it, don't you? And it was a very odd exchange that you had with him.
I had to structure, this was the other weird thing, when you're trying to find someone that you get the idea people don't want you to find or understand about, you have to strategize before you activate everyone talking. So I had to start kind of with people who were outside of that structure and move inward. And so when I finally reached out to the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, this is, by the way, I have to say, after I just did a formal request for, can you tell me what this priest parish assignments were? I did get those things from the archivist. That's a very standard type of request. But this was now more like, well, tell me about that time. Tell me about what you remember about this person, what happened to him, and so forth. And I requested through the media office this interview. And they said, well, we need to know the name of the priest. And I thought, oh man, I know it's your job to run me around. I know it's your job to give me the things I already have. So I said, well, I'd rather send you a picture. And I wanted to send a picture that showed that I had been on the site, because it was not a picture that was Googleable. It was not a picture that existed anywhere except on a wall at the seminary. And so I sent that photograph and no name and said, I figured they would say, well, bye-bye, never mind. And they kind of left me on pause, and it was this, push me, pull you, drawn out thing. And then eventually, when I said, is it more accurate for me to report that I have, the Archbishop has declined my request for interview, or that he's unavailable? Tell me which one. And and she said, well, I don't think he's available. And then she said, you know what, send them by email, which is of course its own nightmare, but it's part of the story. And so I spent a day crafting those questions. And then I got a very surreal, like, again, it was very strange, where the bishop, probably working with his secretary, had crafted these responses. And the most interesting one was his response to Leduc, which was almost depositional language. And that for me was also like, wow, he also used his familiar name, which most people did not do, which was the tell for me, like, okay, you did know this person. I think it was a very disturbing encounter because it was so drawn out. It wasn't just no, it wasn't yes. It was, I think I write this in the book, that it seemed designed in a way to make me feel bad for even asking about it. And that's the way that inquiry into these matters tends to work. And it works against journalists, certainly, or writers, but it works against anyone who has a serious complaint. They're always leveraging a kind of, oh, gee, I'm so disappointed that you would. 2 weeks after the shooting, following leads from Texas law enforcement, an FBI agent interviewed the priest in Alaska. By that date, his friend's picture had already appeared on the cover of Time, looking pudgy in a white cardigan, with a fluffy toy dog at his elbow and a newspaper spread across his lap. Life magazine printed the photo of bride and groom kissing each other at the wedding while the priest's small face smiled in the background. In his white surplice and with his small stature, he could have passed for an altar boy. The priest's name did not yet appear in any articles. The Life magazine cover was filled with a close-up of a window shattered by two of his friend's bullets, with the tower casting its own dark reflection across the cracks. The glassy edge of each round hole gleamed in the late-day sunlight. The empty center was rimmed by a lacy starburst where a hand could almost press a host to fit inside. These were not victims the priest had prepared for, and they would be difficult for him to understand. No one had taught him about senseless crimes that were not holy mysteries that could not be consecrated on an altar with traditional words of blessing. Perhaps someone had tried, but he had missed the lesson. News showed footage of a woman collapsed for protection behind a searing hot flagpole, and men with rifles crouched on the street behind parked cars, and students with cameras and binoculars gathered around a fountain. There was a young man who had returned from Vietnam who said he cleared 2 bodies from the line of fire. There were images of a white ambulance with its back door hanging open and someone's bloody leg. There were images of the clock tower on high, like a tabernacle atop an altar.
I wondered if how much then the events that surrounded the Catholic Church, I wonder how much they fed into the book you were writing. And you referenced, for instance, Spotlight, about the investigation of the abuse in the Catholic Church, the Boston Globe undertook. I wondered how much that surrounded your work as well.
Well, I mean, Spotlight had not come out when I was working on the book. It came out just after the book was kind of in process to be published, kind of almost simultaneous. However, I knew, and I also had to understand, when you're kind of stepping into something, right? You're looking for a priest who's dead, that there aren't a lot of open records available about, who's connected to a mass shooting. And people are a little strange when you talk to them about him, and evasive, and they tell you stuff and it's not great. And you find strange records like, oh, he had this cabin and took out a big loan against it and so forth. You have to kind of know the milieu, the world that you're stepping into. And I was not looking for this priest in 1956 when people, thought Catholics were cool, and it was, before Kennedy, but Catholics were in the American mainstream. They were not kind of a minoritized religion, and they were, entering into their place in the mid 20th century. And everyone had a fantasy that Bing Crosby, was the, parish priest. That's a fantasy, of course, and it's a media fantasy. But I knew that even asking about, well, where is this priest after he's dead, after 2002, which is kind of the bombshell that now we know as the Spotlight bombshell, but at the time it was unfolding in the U.S. And disillusioning Catholics and freaking people out, and kind of like, wait, if it's this bad in Boston, what about elsewhere? And of course, then it activates people's willingness to talk about these things, but it also activates a defensiveness. It activates a protectionism, right? And so I just knew that I was going to kind of have to be in this weird middle place where, was I going to have to say, look, I'm not working for a lawyer. Look, I don't have a complaint against this person. However, if there is one, I want to know about it. I mean, it's a very weird thing to be in 2012 asking about someone who was a priest, who died in 1981. And I just knew people were going to be, well, why are you asking? And that's an interesting, different kind of dilemma.
Yeah, I mean, did you just go out to set and write this book? What kind of, did you have any kind of funding to do it, or was it just kind of a bit of a personal, kind of just your desire to write this book?
No, I think, I knew that my second book was going to be related to kind of transition from school violence specifically to public violence, to looking at that more broadly in the U.S. And I didn't know, as I said at the beginning, that it was going to be entirely dedicated to this. And I think, I didn't have support. I mean, there have been, articles that I've written that I've been paid for, but I didn't have any, I didn't have institutional support for this book. And I didn't have a grant or something like that. So it really was very much a matter of, I guess you could call it compulsion.
The fact that you had to undertake this journey and the difficulties, and I just wondered if you think this says anything about how stories like Whitman's are reported in the kind of journey that you undertook.
Yes, I think that generally we oversimplify. And I realize that some of that is a function of media forms, right? So if you have 2 minutes to tell a story that's a commemoration of the 1966 shooting, you have your bullet points that you hit, no pun intended. And so there's that. But there also are very powerful narrative structures. Again, going back to part of the reason I structured this book is I wanted to do it in a way that would disarm that. You're not opening the book with the shooting, even though you maybe know that there's a shooting coming. You're starting with the priest and the mass ritual, right? What is that? So I kept trying to defamiliarize. I think we already know it. There is that sense of a kind of almost cavalier. I've had people say to me, "Oh yeah, that's the one where he had a tumor and that was it." It's like, well, how much, what?
Referring to Charles's, the autopsy found that he had that might be responsible for his violent impulses.
We have to be very careful here because the autopsy that was done on Whitman showed there appeared to be a tumor, but then they lost his brain, and there is some disagreement about whether there was a tumor. Whether that particular tumor in his case would have had anything to do with these things. That is very different from the study of particular brain impairments in particular cases and patterns in those type of things, like looking at the amygdala. There are people who study that. So if we say, for example, that maybe there was no tumor here, or that this tumor didn't affect and create this. In fact, again, the work that I'm doing right now suggests that this was a long time coming. That idea of trying to isolate a solitary cause and then that's the story of the thing and I'm done now is truly, it's a disturbing way to tell a story, and it's also pressing aside any sense of the particulars of this story, right?
And that does tie into, though, doesn't it, how stories like Whitman's are reported. And it seems one of the achievements of the book is there could be a lot of reasons for Charles Whitman's crime, and Leduc's involvement with that as well. And you've spoken, you've referenced a lot of the different environmental factors that could have contributed to Whitman's crime. You've spoken about some of the biological ones as well. And you speak about these in the book, but you never seem to ascribe a particular cause. I wonder, did you find it difficult writing something like this to avoid going down a particular route or a particular path to?
No. I think that the idea of trying to understand how in some ways this violence is very ordinary. In the Catholic calendar, the shooting, this extraordinary shooting, happened on August 1st, 1966, which is an ordinary time is what it's called. So it's kind of this place in the calendar. It's not Advent, it's not Lent, it's not around a feast, it's not Easter. And so for me, the idea of all of these things contributing, that in an individual life, it's very weird. We do is it nature or is it nurture, or was it a tumor, or was it his father, or was it the fact that he bonded with someone who now, since my book has come out, has been listed as a credibly accused molester of children.
Yeah.
Gee, it kind of looks like it might rain here. It's just like something bad is probably going to happen here. So I guess the thing is when it's more like, you could take one of these things away and you have 12 other things, and so I think for me it was more about how to wrestle those things into a kind of structure that someone could follow, and that would help them to unravel a little bit that comfortability with, oh, it was this or that. So I found that actually part of the excitement is maybe not the right word, but part of the puzzle of the book for me was figuring out how to talk about these layers as overlapping and these pieces as connected, as opposed to, well, because we have, I'm not saying he was Catholic, therefore, or the priest was an alcoholic, therefore. That's not it. I mean, it's not really it in any story. It's trying to look at these things as interlocking pieces, and then in an individual life where the person is or isn't coming to terms with things, where they do or don't have good mentors, whether they're surrounded by enablers who are always making excuses for them, it's just, it's amazing to me how on the one hand people want to say, there was a tumor, or it was because he was trained in the military, or whatever. Or on the other hand, it's amazing denialism, which is, well, he just had a bad day. I don't even know what that was. That's not the man I knew. It's like, well, you didn't know him very well.
It's quite strange because Whitman comes across as quite this, quite a kind of hollow character, and there could be a chance of kind of pitying, Whitman and his childhood, which I don't think would be the right response for ultimately what the book is about and what he ultimately did. And it's a fine line. You're skirting a lot of fine lines and a lot of ways to sort of not blame but articulate the issue and the environment in which he's in.
I think what I would say is that the idea of any type of catharsis, when we talk about it in drama, of course this is still Western, but is that you have that sense of pity and fear at the same moment. And so he is a pathetic figure. He is. I would argue that there is something that is so broken, and you can see it in this Priest story, you can see it in Whitman's story, and you can see it in my story of trying to put these broken pieces together and to make some kind of sense of it. But I would argue that you can feel a sense of pity may not be the perfect word for it, but a sense of, oh, it's just a kind of overwhelm, almost beyond language, a sense of some sympathy and accountability at the same moment, and a sense of fear, in a sense of repulsion that, okay, so could this happen to me? Could I do this? Am I contributing to this? Am I helping prevent this? What's my role in this? That sense of self-implication is also something that I was trying to wrestle with, and that was kind of me in the middle with my muddy hands in that middle section. Well, I'm not saying this, but can you please tell me that he was amazing and really a wonderful person, talking about the priest, right? And he was not. But you look at his childhood, and it looks very lonely and looks very isolated. And he was in a church that fears women and permits all kinds of things. If it's if you have the right advisor, the right mentor, it just replicates over and over.
Yeah, and imagine, and like you said, imagine that was different, and especially finding out later. So as I understand it, after you published this book, we did find out more about Priest Leduc, and as you said, he was what's the terminology? Credibly accused of.
Right. He was identified. Many dioceses across the U.S. in 2018 were experiencing a lot of pressure, and Galveston, Houston, which was Leduc's diocese for about 15 or so years, was under pressure to list it had held back, for a diocese of its size, it had held back its names. It had only those who had gone into litigation were listed. And so in January 2019, the Chancery Office and the Archbishop listed its credibly accused priests, and Leduc's name was there. And I have to tell you, it was 8 months after Mass came out. I was shocked. I thought that if his name deserved to be there, they would not give it up. So it was interesting to me that it was listed. It was also supremely unsatisfying. On the one hand, vindicating, like, okay, I was looking somewhere, it felt like trouble, there was trouble. Okay, but we don't know the number of accusations. We don't know the locations of victims because of the slipperiness of his name. The outreach to find anyone who might be old enough to still be surviving any abuse, maybe they didn't know him as Leduc, they knew him as Father Gill, so they may not even recognize his name if they thought. It was something to see that. I will not lie. I almost fell on the floor. I had a friend who was in Houston at the time, another researcher, who saw the list as soon as it was revealed to media, and she called me immediately. And I will never forget that moment. I just, okay, but now what?
I don't know if this is just endemic of this character, Leduc. He's such an ephemeral kind of figure, and such an influential figure on Whitman. I do want to speak about this, because I know it's something that's very you've written about it before, and I know it's very important to you. And it is the act of how Whitman's act started when by killing his wife and his mother, and there are many victims in acts like this, and there are many narratives which we don't hear about. We don't hear about all the victims' narratives, and if we could just talk a bit more about what happened here. And how it related to how events unfolded.
Yes, I think in this case, and I think that in a lot of cases, recent reports of a database in the U.S. called Americans for Gun Safety. It's basically a database of mass shooting events and specifically looking at guns. More than half of those events are preceded by some account of abuse or murder in the household, or of an intimate partner. So that gets, it may not be the spouse, right? But it may be the girlfriend or maybe the intimate partner, mostly heterosexual, and most of the perpetrators are male. And it seems to me, and I've written about this in different places, but it seems to me that the violence against these intimate others, who are often construed as feminine, right? The guardians and the in some ways the discarded feminine influences in the killer's life. That intimate violence is a kind of gateway to the public performance, and in Whitman's case, it's a very reverse Garden of Gethsemane thing that happens. I don't know if you know that story in the New Testament, where Christ goes into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray with his apostles at night, and let this cup pass, and then he gets betrayed in the garden, and then the next day, he's arrested, and then he's eventually crucified, right? And in Whitman's story, we know, at least according to what he writes, that he'd been thinking about murdering his wife for 2 days. Then he murders his mother. He's like, and then I'm going to murder my mother too. He adds that in. He murders his mother and his wife the night before the mass shooting on the tower. And he writes letters and makes notes and packs his trunk and everything, and under the cover of night, when his wife's body is in the bedroom. One of the things that people don't often know, and this is the reason why I think it's important to talk about gun violence and gender-based violence or violence against intimate partners that does not involve a gun, because he stabbed his mother and his wife. And there is almost a sense of a very twisted honor type of killing. He bought a specific knife, bought a brand new knife, and he kills his mother and his wife. And I think that the idea of uncovering the narrative, it's really important to think about, well, what was he like to live with? Who was sharing a bed with this person? Who was cooking for this person? Who was ironing this person's shirts, And this idea, we have this very repetitive story. We go, well, that was just backstory. And it's like, no, that's actually the first thing. That's the very first thing that happens. And so we have a kind of lack of curiosity about that in a weird way protects a certain kind of mythology about the home. The home is the man's castle and so forth. So I think that it's important to see those any victim in the home, whether it's fatal violence or not, has expertise that we do not turn to. And I think it's important for us to wonder and be curious and to learn from what they might have to teach us.
Is this an uncovered aspect?
I mean, the data right now show that it's more than 50% of the time that someone who commits a mass shooting in public has already murdered people at home. Right, more than half of the time. So that's a pattern. That's not a one-off. That's not 2%. So, and the other thing that's important for us to recognize is that many times we don't have a mass shooting event in public. It stops at the home, and maybe it doesn't qualify as what quote unquote counts as a mass shooting because it's just a killing of the family, and that's 3 people. Right. And so there are all these different ways to look at the data, and we have to kind of keep circling back to what was happening in the home. There's a hierarchy of victimology, and different theorists write about this, about who is the perfect victim to deserve our sympathy. Right. And that's very racialized. It's often gendered. It's often based on a kind of distance. If the person didn't know you and they shot you, well, you're obviously an innocent victim. You had nothing to do with them. But if you lived in the house with them, well, maybe he had a reason. Like there is a very interesting turn that we make that basically again shuts off that spigot of inquiry and curiosity and a willingness to learn from the people who really are the first responders before we hear that crack in the sky.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is where your work's going to take you next. Is there more to sort of tell of this story, do you think?
Yes. Right now I am working on a book for the University of Texas Press, and it is a book that is fleshing out the narrative, the life story of Charles Whitman's wife, Kathy Leisner Whitman. And it is based on an archive of private correspondence between Kathy and her husband. They were separated due to military circumstances on and off for more than half of their marriage, actually. But also her to her mother, and then also from him to her. And inside this archive, we can really see what it's like to live with a coercive and controlling partner when you really are trying to reason with and make it better and move forward in your own life, and realizing that you may need to leave. And as we know, when a woman is even considering leaving, if her partner knows about that, she is most vulnerable to being discarded or being attacked or being killed. So in any case, that's what I'm working on now, is really trying to understand Kathy's life in her language at the time, without theory, as she was living it and trying to make sense of it. And there's a lot to learn and to understand there.
I mean, is there any repair, possible? Is there any repair possible with events like this, or is this it? Is this act of writing this book that repair?
Right. I mean, you were talking about the wounded victim who perished from his injury in 2001, and I read somewhere that that this individual just decided to stop undergoing dialysis, and so they just couldn't do that anymore. You think about all of the people who were killed. Charles Whitman is dead. The priest is dead. Charles Whitman's family members, his brothers are dead. His father and mother are dead. Obviously killed his mother. So the idea of repair, I think, on the one hand, I do believe there is something about repair in memory, and a narrative repair, which is trying to make things available to consider and to see. Things that have been hidden, things that have been secret, things that have been mystified, that maybe are not, and that we can have more clarity about that has a healing property, but it doesn't bring anyone back from the dead.
Joe, Scott-Coe, Mass, a Sniper, a Father, and a Priest is out now. It's published by Pelicanesis, and it's been, it's a heavy topic, and it's, tough talking about it. It's tough reading about it. So, Joe, thank you very much for joining me all the way in California.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Liam.
My thanks to Joe for joining me today on the Rippling Pages podcast, and of course, my thanks to you again for listening. Now, if you'd like to get in touch with the Rippling Pages podcast, you can do so via Twitter or Instagram, and that's at Rippling_pages. That's at Rippling_page, and that's for both Twitter and Instagram. You can drop us a message if you like at ripplingpagespod@gmail.com. Otherwise, it's until next time, where I'm going to be joined by Charlie Bayliss, and he's here to talk to me about his poetry collection, Santa Lucia.